2 days before Christmas, my parents sent a single text making it clear they were not just forgetting me, but erasing me. They did not know I had just signed legal documents capable of turning their living room into a courtroom. The man they call a leech is the only person in the city who can freeze their entire empire in 1 hour. My reply in the family group chat triggered the most ruthless Christmas Eve takedown imaginable. My name is Briar Kensington, and for 34 years, I have existed as a smudge on the pristine lens of my family's life. I live in Port Mason, South Carolina, a town where the humidity usually clings to you like a second skin. But today, 2 days before Christmas, the air was brittle and cold. It was the kind of cold that snaps branches and freezes water in the pipes if you are not careful. My apartment reflected none of the chaotic, over-decorated excess that my parents adored. It was small, located on the 3rd floor of a converted brick warehouse, and it was militantly tidy. Every coaster was aligned. Every book on the shelf was flush with the edge. I needed order because the people who shared my DNA thrived on emotional anarchy masked as high society etiquette. I was standing by the kitchen island, staring at the steam rising from a black mug of coffee, when my phone vibrated against the granite countertop. It was not a ring. It was a single, long buzz that signaled a message from the one group chat I kept muted for 11 months out of the year. The screen lit up, cutting through the gray afternoon light of the living room. Kensington family events. My stomach did not drop. That implies shock or fear. Instead, my stomach tightened, turning into a knot of hard muscle. I knew what was coming. I had felt the barometric pressure of the family dynamic shifting for weeks, ever since I had politely declined to chip in for a joint gift for a distant cousin I had not seen since I was 12. I picked up the phone. The message was from my mother, Diane. She did not start with a greeting. Diane Kensington did not believe in wasting pleasantries on the family scapegoat when she had a directive to issue. The text read, "The family has discussed it. We agree that it is best if you do not make an appearance at the Christmas Eve party this year." I stared at the words. They were so sterile, so corporate. It was like being fired from a job you never applied for. The cursor on the screen blinked, taunting me, but another message bubbled up immediately after, providing the justification. Diane wrote, "Cameron is not comfortable with your attitude lately. It would cause unnecessary tension, and we want a happy evening for everyone." Cameron. Of course it was Cameron, my brother-in-law, the golden retriever in a tailored suit, the man who had walked into the Kensington family 5 years ago and charmed the diamonds off my mother's fingers and the skepticism right out of my father's chest. To them, Cameron was the son they wished they had born. He was the vice president of sales at a tech firm. He played golf at the club on Sundays, and he knew exactly which wine to order to impress the local senators. He was the glossy but high-definition upgrade to their lives. To me, Cameron was something entirely different, but my parents did not care about my version of the truth. They only cared that Cameron brought prestige, while I brought awkward questions and an inability to pretend that our family was functional. I looked down at the screen again. A small icon popped up beneath my mother's dismissal. A pink heart. It was from my younger sister, Paige. That single digital reaction hit me harder than the text itself. Paige, who I used to shield from our parents' criticism when we were children. Paige, who I had driven to college orientation because our parents were too busy vacationing in the vineyard. She had double-tapped the message, effectively signing off on my exile. It was a seal of approval, a stamp that said she chose the winner, and I was, as always, the loser. The silence in my apartment seemed to deepen. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren wailing a few blocks over. Normally, this would be the part where the old Briar would crumble. The Briar of her 20s would have called her mother, voice trembling, begging for an explanation. I would have asked what I had done wrong. I would have apologized for sins I had not committed just to be allowed back into the fold. To sit at the foot of the table and eat cold turkey while they ignored me. I would have cried hot, humiliating tears, and spent Christmas alone, wondering why I was so unlovable. But I was 34 now, and I was tired. I did not feel the sting of tears. My eyes were dry. My pulse was steady. What I felt was a sudden, terrifying clarity. It was as if the last tether holding me to them had just snapped, not with a bang, but with a quiet, decisive click. They were not excluding me because I was difficult. They were not excluding me because I was rude. They were excluding me because they were afraid. Deep down, beneath the layers of denial and expensive scotch, they knew that my presence was a threat. I was the only one who did not clap when Cameron told his exaggerated war stories of business conquests. I was the only one who noticed that the math did not add up when they talked about the new renovations on the estate. I was the mirror they did not want to look into. Cameron was uncomfortable because I saw him. I really saw him. And for a narcissist like Cameron, being seen is the ultimate danger. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I could write a paragraph. I could scream in uppercase letters. I could list every sacrifice I had made for them, every loan I had co-signed and paid off, every secret I had kept. Instead, I typed 8 words. Perfect. Then you will not see me again either. I hit send. I watched the delivery status change to delivered, then raid. I did not wait for the typing bubble to appear. I placed the phone face down on the counter with a definitive thud. The vibration of the action traveled up my arm, grounding me. I turned around. Sitting in the armchair by the window was Reed. To my family, Reed Halston was a non-entity. My mother called him the wallflower. My father called him that guy with the cheap shoes. They thought he was a mid-level office drone with zero ambition and the personality of a wet cardboard box. They mocked his silence. They ignored him at dinners, talking over him as if he were a piece of furniture. They thought I was settling for him because I could not land a shark like Cameron. They had no idea. Reed was reading a hardcover book, his legs crossed at the ankles. He was wearing a gray cable-knit sweater that softened the sharp angles of his jaw, but it did not hide the alert intelligence in his eyes. He lowered the book slowly as I turned. He did not ask what the text said. He did not ask why my back had gone rigid. He just looked at me. His eyes were dark, calm, and utterly devoid of the frantic need for approval that plagued my family. "They did it," I said. My voice was level. It sounded strange to my own ears, lacking the wobble of emotion I expected. "They uninvited me. Cameron's orders." Reed closed his book and placed it on the side table. He did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had checked the weather forecast and saw that the predicted storm had finally arrived. "And?" Reed asked. "One word. Simple." "And I told them that was perfect," I replied. Reed nodded. It was a small movement, barely an inch, but it carried the weight of a gavel striking a sound block. "It is time," he said. The words hung in the air between us. It is time. We had whispered those words for months. We had said them in the dark while lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the voicemails my mother left demanding money or favors. We had said them when Cameron made snide comments about Reed's income at the Thanksgiving dinner I was barely allowed to attend. But now, they were not a wish. They were a command. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of coffee and the faint, clean smell of lemon polish. I felt light, weightless. The crushing burden of trying to be the daughter they wanted was gone, replaced by the cold resolve of the woman they had created. I walked past Reed, down the short hallway to the bedroom. I did not stop at the bed. I went straight to the closet. My closet was as organized as the rest of my life. Color-coded shirts, shoes in clear boxes, but I was not looking for clothes. I knelt on the floor and reached into the very back, behind a stack of winter coats that I rarely needed in South Carolina. My hand closed around the cool, smooth surface of a leather portfolio. It was black, unassuming. It looked like something you would carry a resume in, but it was heavy. I pulled it out and stood up. The dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window seemed to swirl around it. This portfolio had been sitting there for 3 months, sealed. I had placed a piece of tamper-evident tape over the clasp 3 months ago, on a Tuesday, after a meeting that had left my hands shaking and my heart racing. I had promised myself I would only open it if there was no other choice. I had promised myself that I would give them one last chance to be decent human beings, one last Christmas to prove that I was more than just a resource to be mined and discarded. They had made their choice. They had sent it in a text message with a heart emoji attached to the insult. I carried the portfolio back into the living room. Reed was standing now. He had moved to the kitchen island, standing right where I had been. He watched me approach. I placed the black folder on the granite. It made a heavy, solid sound. I looked at the seal. It was intact. "Are you sure?" Reed asked. His voice was soft. But it was not a question of doubt. It was a final check, a safety protocol. "Once you open that, Briar, the bridge is not just burned, it is incinerated. There is no going back to Sunday dinners. There is no going back to pretending." I looked at the phone, still face down on the counter. I thought about Paige's heart reaction. I thought about my mother's cold dismissal. I thought about Cameron's smug, oily smile, and the way he looked at me, like I was a bug he wanted to crush but did not want to get on his shoe. "They burned the bridge. Reed," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I am just blowing up the ruins so they cannot follow me." I reached out and hooked my finger under the seal. With a sharp tearing sound, the tape gave way. I flipped the latch. The folder fell open. Inside was not just paper. Inside was the autopsy of the Kensington legacy. There were bank statements. There were transfer records. There were emails that Cameron thought he had deleted. And on top of the stack was a document titled simply, "Assignment of Debt and Deed of Trust." I ran my hand over the paper. It felt crisp. It felt real. "Get your suit," I told Reed, not looking up from the documents. "We have a party to crash." Reed smiled. It was a rare, sharp thing that did not reach his eyes but showed his teeth. "I will drive," he said. I looked at the date on the top document. December 24th, tomorrow. My parents thought they were erasing me. They thought that by telling me to stay away, they were protecting their perfect image. They thought I would stay in my small apartment, crying into a glass of wine, while they toasted to their own magnificence in the family mansion. They were wrong. They had invited a ghost to their party, but the ghost was bringing a sledgehammer. The file on the counter was not just a collection of paper. It was a physical manifestation of a truth I had swallowed for 5 years. My family did not love Cameron because he was a good man. They loved him because he was a human shield against their own incompetence. I stood there, tracing the edge of the documents, and the memories did not wash over me like a tide. They hit me like punches I had forgotten to block. To the outside world, and specifically to the elite social circle of Port Mason, Cameron was the savior. He was the one who stepped in when my father's investments in vintage cars and failing tech startups drained the family liquidity. Cameron was the one who knew the bank managers by their first names. He was the one who could make a phone call and have a foreclosure notice disappear, replaced by a restructuring plan that looked like a promotion rather than a rescue. He bought them dignity. He paid for the country club memberships that they could no longer afford on their own, and in exchange, they gave him the one thing he craved more than money: absolute, unquestioning authority. But I knew the cost of that authority. Before Cameron was my sister's husband, before he was the son my father never had, he was mine. It is a detail the family has conveniently scrubbed from the official history, like a stain on a photo that gets airbrushed out. 6 years ago, I brought him home. I was the one who introduced him to the intricacies of the Kensington ego. Back then, I was 28, naive, and desperate for someone to look at me the way Cameron did, with an intensity I mistook for passion. It took me 6 months to realize that intensity was actually surveillance. I remember a dinner at a seafood restaurant on the pier. It was my birthday. Cameron had ordered for me because he said I always picked the wrong wines. When I made a joke about his tie being too serious for a Tuesday, his hand had shot out under the table. He squeezed my thigh so hard, his thumb dug into the muscle, leaving a bruise that lasted for a week. He smiled at my parents while he did it, and my breath hitched in my throat, freezing the smile on my face. I tried to tell them later, I tried to tell my mother that he checked my phone while I slept. I tried to tell her that he told me what to wear, who to speak to, and how to laugh. I remember standing in her dressing room, the smell of expensive lavender potpourri choking me, as I showed her the bruise on my arm from where he had grabbed me too hard when I tried to leave a party early. Diane Kensington had not looked at the bruise. She had looked at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace. "You provoked him. Briar," she had said, her voice light, as if discussing the weather. "Cameron is a man of status. When you contradict him in public, you humiliate him. Of course he gets angry. If you embarrass a man like that, you have to expect a reaction." That was the moment the glass shattered. For years, I told myself they were just old-fashioned. I told myself they did not understand modern relationships. But standing in that dressing room, I realized the truth was far colder. They did not care if he hurt me. They only cared that he paid the bills. When I finally broke up with him, it was messy. I was the hysterical ex-girlfriend. He was the calm, heartbroken suitor. And when he pivoted, almost immediately, to my younger sister Paige, who was more pliable, more eager to please, and far more willing to be a trophy, my parents did not scream in horror. They breathed a sigh of relief. They kept the money in the family. They kept the status. All they had to do was trade one daughter for another. I looked up from the documents to Reed. He was watching me with that steady, anchoring gaze. "They are not victims. Reed," I said quietly. "I spent so long thinking they were just fooled by him. I thought if I could just show them the real Cameron, they would wake up. But they are not asleep. They are complicit." Reed walked over to the kitchen island. He did not touch me. He knew I did not want comfort right now. I wanted validation. "They made a transaction," Reed said. "They sold their autonomy for his checkbook. And now they want to remove me because I am the living reminder of the bill of sale," I replied. "I am the only one who remembers when he was a monster, not a mascot." I looked at Reed. Really looked at him. My family saw a man who wore off-the-rack suits and drove a sedan that was 5 years old. They saw a man who spoke little and ate less at their tables. They thought he was a mid-level administrator, pushing papers in some dreary cubicle, lucky to even be allowed in the room with the illustrious Kensingtons. They did not know that Reed Halston was a ghost in the corporate machine. "You have the recording devices ready?" I asked. Reed nodded. 2 sets, one on my person, one backup in the bag. High fidelity, distinct vocal separation, admissible in court, under the single-party consent laws of South Carolina. Reed worked for the Graymont Compliance Group. To the layperson, the name sounded like a boring accounting firm. In reality, Graymont was the entity that multinational corporations called when they had a problem that could not be solved by a press release. Reed was a crisis management specialist, but not the kind that spins stories for the news. He was the kind that audited internal corruption, traced embezzled funds, and prepared the kill packets, the legal dossiers so damning that the opposing party would settle before a lawsuit was ever filed. He spent his days dismantling executives who thought they were untouchable. He spent his days analyzing the structural weaknesses of empires much larger than the Kensingtons' fragile little kingdom. He was not a fighter. He was an architect of collapse. "I do not want you to hit him," I said, my voice firm. "Cameron is going to try to provoke you. He is going to treat you like the help. He is going to try to get a reaction so he can play the victim again." "He can try," Reed said, a dry amusement coloring his tone. "Men like Cameron rely on the assumption that everyone else is operating on emotion. He thinks this is a street fight. He does not realize it is an audit." I took a deep breath. The anger that usually sat in my chest, hot and corrosive, was gone. In its place was a cold, mechanical drive. I did not want to scream at my mother. I did not want to slap my sister. I did not want to punch my father. Those were small, temporary victories. I wanted to dismantle the stage they stood on. "I am not doing this because I am hurt. Reed," I confessed, and it felt like the truest thing I had ever said. "If I was just hurt, I would stay home. I would block their numbers and move to another state. But if I leave now, they win. They keep doing this. They will drain everything dry. And when the money runs out, they will blame me for not being there to save them. They will rewrite history until I am the villain in every story. I tap the folder. They use money as a weapon. They use shame as a weapon. They think they can text me 2 days before Christmas and discard me like a seasonal decoration because they hold all the cards. Reed reached out and finally placed his hand over mine, on top of the black leather. His hand was warm. They hold the cards they can see, Reed corrected. They do not know we are playing a different game entirely. I looked at the clock on the stove. It was time to get ready. I needed to transform. I could not walk into Renford House as Briar the disappointed daughter. I had to walk in as Briar the majority shareholder of their destruction. I thought about the throne my parents sat on, the respect of the community, the fear of their peers, the illusion of old money that Cameron polished for them every day. It was built on fraud. It was built on leverage. It was built on the silence of the people they had stepped on. They think they are kings and queens, I whispered, but they are just squatters in a house of cards. I pulled my hand away and picked up the file. If they like erasing my name, I said, looking Reed dead in the eye, I will erase their throne. Reed nodded once. Then let us go to work. We moved toward the bedroom to change. The sun was setting outside, casting long, dark shadows across the floor. The time for talking was over. The time for execution had begun. The transformation happened in silence. The bedroom, usually a place of rest, felt like a tactical staging ground. I stripped off the comfortable clothes of the woman who had been rejected and pulled on the armor of the woman who was about to strike back. I chose a dress that was the antithesis of a Christmas party. It was black, severe, and cut with a geometric precision that offered no softness. There was no lace, no velvet, no festive shimmer. It was a sheath of dark fabric that reached my knees, paired with opaque black tights and shoes with a heel sharp enough to puncture floorboards. I threw a long charcoal wool coat over it. When I looked in the mirror, I did not look like a daughter coming home for the holidays. I looked like a court summons in human form. Reed was already waiting by the door. The transformation in him was even more startling. Gone was the soft cable-knit sweater. In its place was a navy suit, tailored to within a millimeter of perfection. It was the kind of suit that whispered authority, not the flashy, loud authority of Cameron, but the quiet, terrifying authority of the man who signs the termination papers. He held a slim leather briefcase in his hand. It was not the bulky bag of a commuter. It was the streamlined case of a closer. "Ready?" he asked. "Let us go," I replied. We took his car, a clean, nondescript black sedan. It was anonymous, the kind of car that blends into traffic, invisible until it pulls up right beside you. As we merged onto the highway leading toward the wealthy district of Port Mason, the atmosphere inside the vehicle shifted. We were no longer a couple. We were a team executing a hostile takeover. "Run me through the structure one last time," Reed said, his eyes scanning the road. "I want to make sure the terminology I use matches the paperwork exactly." I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the duplicate file. I did not need to read it. I had memorized every line, but holding it grounded me. "The asset in question is Renford House," I recited, my voice devoid of sentiment. "But my parents do not own Renford House personally. They transferred the deed 5 years ago to a shell company called Chimera Holdings Limited. To hide the asset from personal liability lawsuits," Reed noted. "Exactly," I said. "And to dodge inheritance taxes. They thought they were being clever. They thought placing the house in an LLC made it untouchable. But Chimera Holdings has no income. It exists solely to hold the property, to maintain the lifestyle, the parties, the landscaping, the repairs. Chimera took out a series of high-interest loans against the equity of the house." I opened my phone and scrolled to my sister's Instagram page. Paige had posted a story 20 minutes ago. It was a video of the Great Hall, dripping with gold ribbons and crystal ornaments. The caption read, "Generational wealth just hits different. Tradition is everything." "Look at this," I said, showing the screen to Reed, though he kept his eyes on the road. "She is bragging about tradition while standing inside a collateralized debt obligation." "The loans are toxic," Reed said, summarizing the data we had mined. "Balloon payments, variable interest rates, they have been refinancing the interest for 2 years, stacking debt on top of debt. They are technically insolvent." "And the bank got tired of it," I finished. "The primary lender bundled the distressed debt and put it up for sale on the secondary market last week. They wanted it off their books before the fiscal year ended." This was the pivot point. This was the moment fate had aligned with my fury. My parents assumed that banks were static, monolithic institutions that would always extend them grace because of their last name. They did not understand how modern finance worked. They did not understand that debt is a product, and like any product, it can be bought by anyone with enough capital and the right timing. "And you bought the bundle," Reed said. "I bought the bundle," I confirmed. "Through a blind trust, as of yesterday afternoon. I am not their daughter. I am the primary creditor of Chimera Holdings. I own the mortgage. I own the liens. I effectively own the roof over their heads." Reed signaled and took the exit ramp toward the coast. The road here was darker, lined with old oak trees that draped moss over the asphalt like tattered curtains. "The trigger is the default clause," Reed reminded me. "They missed the November payment. They are 30 days past due. The contract states that upon 30 days of delinquency, the creditor has the right to accelerate the debt, demand full repayment immediately, or initiate foreclosure proceedings to secure the asset. And since the asset is held by an LLC, not individuals, there are no homestead protections," I added. "It is a commercial foreclosure, immediate, brutal." Reed reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. He handed it to me. "Check the battery," he instructed. I twisted the top of the pen. A tiny, almost invisible blue light pulsed once, then vanished. It was a high-grade recording device, capable of capturing audio across a crowded room. "It is active," I said. Reed tapped his left ear. He was wearing an earpiece that looked like a standard Bluetooth device for phone calls, but I knew it was connected to a recorder in his jacket pocket. "I need them to admit to the coercion," Reed said, his voice dropping low. "The financial leverage is the hammer, Briar, but the coercion is the nail in the coffin. We need them to say, on record, that they are using the threat of disowning you or damaging your reputation to force you to comply. We need proof that Cameron is the architect of this extortion." "They will say it," I assured him. "They are arrogant. They think they are untouchable in that house. They will not filter themselves because they do not think anyone in that room has the power to hold them accountable." I opened the file on my lap again. There it was, the purchase and sale agreement, the assignment of mortgage, and the most damning document of all, a personal guarantee my father had signed 2 years ago to secure a bridge loan. He had pledged his personal stock portfolio as collateral. He had signed it with the flourish he used for autographs, never reading the fine print that said the creditor could seize those assets without a court order if the LLC defaulted. Reed slowed the car down. We were approaching the private lane that led to Renford House. "One question," Reed said. He did not look at me. He looked at the iron gates looming ahead. "Are you sure you can handle the room?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, the moment you put these papers on the table, you become the villain in their story forever," Reed said. "They will not see the logic. They will not see the justice. They will only see that you destroyed Christmas. Every aunt, every cousin, every business partner in that room is going to look at you and call you a monster. They will call you a destroyer." I looked out the window, through the trees. I could see the glow of the mansion. It looked warm and inviting, a beacon of holiday cheer. But I knew what it really was. It was a stage set. It was a facade held up by lies and borrowed money. "They have called me a disappointment for 10 years, I said. "They have called me ungrateful. They have called me difficult. Destroyer actually sounds like an upgrade." Reed smirked. "Fair enough. I have been the villain in their narrative since the day I refused to be their puppet," I continued. "I can handle the hatred. Read, what I cannot handle is one more day of their hypocrisy. We pulled up to the gate. The security guard, a man named Thomas who had worked there for 20 years, peered into the car. He recognized me. He looked confused for a second. He knew I was not on the list. But he also knew I was the eldest daughter. Old habits die hard. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the clipboard. I rolled down the window. I did not smile. "Merry Christmas, Thomas," I said. "Open the gate." It was not a request. It was the first order of the new regime. Thomas blinked, then nodded instinctively and hit the button. The heavy iron gate swung open with a groan. As we drove up the winding driveway, the house came into full view. Renford House, a sprawling Georgian estate with white pillars and massive windows. Every window was blazing with light. A 20-foot Christmas tree stood in the foyer, visible through the glass. Expensive cars lined the circular drive. Mercedes, Bentley, Porsche. It looked impenetrable. It looked like a fortress of old money and power. But as I stepped out of the car into the biting cold air, clutching the black portfolio against my chest, I did not see a fortress. I saw a castle made of wet paper. I saw the hairline cracks in the foundation that only I knew were there. I saw a family partying on the deck of the Titanic, completely unaware that the iceberg was not in the ocean. It was walking up their front steps in a pair of black heels. Reed walked around the car and stood beside me. He adjusted his cuffs. "Shall we?" he asked. "Let us go introduce them to reality," I said. We walked toward the massive oak front doors. I could hear the sound of laughter and jazz music drifting out. It was the sound of a world that believed it was safe. I reached out and pushed the door open. The transition from the biting cold of the driveway to the interior of Renford House was a physical assault on the senses. The air inside was heavy, superheated by a roaring fireplace and the collective body warmth of 150 of Port Mason's elite. It smelled of fresh balsam fir, expensive perfume, and the distinct metallic tang of catered roast beef. As Reed and I stepped across the threshold, the foyer was a kaleidoscope of red velvet, gold sequins, and black tuxedos. A jazz quartet was playing a smooth, inoffensive rendition of Jingle Bells in the corner, providing a soundtrack to the polite murmuring of the crowd. Then, the silence hit. It did not happen all at once. It started near the door, where the guests closest to us stopped mid-sentence, their champagne flutes hovering halfway to their lips, then, like a ripple spreading across a stagnant pond. The quiet moved outward. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. The whispers ceased. Within 10 seconds, the only sound left in the massive entry hall was the jazz bassist, who awkwardly plucked a few more notes before realizing he was playing to a room that had stopped breathing. I stood there, unmoving, my hand gripping the handle of the black portfolio. I felt the weight of their gaze. These were people I had known my entire life. There was Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the charity gala committee and had once told me my hair was too unruly for a debutante. There was Mr. Sterling, the banker who played golf with my father every Sunday and laughed at his racist jokes. They looked at me not with warmth, but with the morbid curiosity of drivers passing a car wreck. They knew I had been cut from the list. In this circle, information traveled faster than light, and my exclusion had been the gossip of the morning. My presence here was a glitch in the matrix of their social order. Before I could take another step, a blur of silver satin materialized from the crowd. It was my mother. Diane Kensington did not run. Running was for the help. But she moved with a frantic, clipped speed that betrayed her panic. She did not open her arms. She did not smile. She reached out and clamped her hand around my upper arm, her manicured nails digging into my bicep through the thick wool of my coat. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice pitched low enough to avoid a scene but vibrating with fury. She did not wait for an answer. She yanked me, physically dragging me away from the center of the foyer toward a semi-secluded alcove near the coat check. Reed followed close behind, his steps silent and measured, ignoring the glare she shot him. "We sent a text," Diane whispered, her eyes darting around the room to see who was watching. We made it very clear. Briar, the family decided, you are not welcome tonight. I looked down at her hand on my arm. She was wearing the diamond bracelet Cameron had given her for her birthday last year. It caught the light, sparkling with a brilliance that felt obscene. I received the text, I said. My voice was calm, contrasting sharply with her frantic energy. I thought it was important to return the favor of a personal visit. You are here to ruin it, she accused, her face twisting into a mask of martyrdom. You cannot stand to see us happy. You cannot stand that Cameron and Paige are the center of attention. Look at you. You are dressed for a funeral. I am dressed for business, I corrected. Over Diane's shoulder, I saw my father, Walter. He was standing near the bar, holding a tumbler of scotch. He had seen me. He did not come over. He stared at me across the room with a look of profound exhaustion, as if my very existence was a debt he was tired of paying. He turned his back to me and signaled the bartender for a refill. That simple gesture hurt more than Diane's nails in my arm. It was a complete dismissal. He was washing his hands of me. You need to leave, Diane said, tightening her grip. Now, before Cameron sees you. He has had a long year, Briar. He does not need your drama tonight. Cameron's year is about to get much longer, I said, as if summoned by his name. The crowd near the entrance to the great hall parted. Cameron emerged. He looked every inch the prince of the manor. He was wearing a midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket that probably cost more than my car. His hair was perfectly coiffed. His smile was bright and practiced, and he held a crystal glass with the casual arrogance of a man who believes he owns the floor he walks on. He spotted us immediately. The smile did not falter. If anything, it widened, but the warmth drained out of it, replaced by a predatory gleam. He walked toward us, not with hurry, but with a swagger. The guests watched him, mesmerized. They loved him. They loved the performance of success he gave them. Briar, Cameron said, his voice booming slightly, ensuring the nearby guests could hear his magnanimity. I did not think you would make it. We thought you were busy. He stopped 3 feet away, invading my personal space just enough to be dominant without being aggressive. He looked me up and down, sneering slightly at my severe black dress. Then, his eyes slid to Reed. Reed was standing perfectly still, holding his slim briefcase. He looked immaculate in his suit, perhaps too immaculate. He did not look like a guest. He looked like a professional. Cameron laughed. It was a sharp barking sound. And you brought help, Cameron said, addressing me but looking at Reed. I did not know you could afford a driver, Briar, or is this an Uber Black situation? The insult was crude, designed to diminish Reed instantly. Cameron wanted to establish the hierarchy. He was the host. Reed was the service staff. My sister, Paige, appeared at Cameron's elbow. She was holding her phone up. The camera lens pointed directly at us. She was recording. Oh my God, Paige giggled, looking at her screen rather than her sister. This is so awkward. Why did you bring him? Is he going to wait in the car? She was framing the narrative in real time for her followers. The desperate sister crashes the party with her low-rent boyfriend. Cameron reached into his tuxedo pocket. He pulled out a money clip, gold, naturally, and peeled off a crisp $100 bill. He stepped forward and tucked the bill into the breast pocket of Reed's suit jacket. The room went dead silent again. It was a gesture of supreme disrespect. It was treating a grown man, a guest, like a servant to be tipped and dismissed. Here, Cameron said, patting Reed's chest patronizingly. Why don't you go wait in the kitchen? The staff is serving sliders. Grab yourself a plate. I am sure you are hungry. Diane let out a breathy, nervous laugh, looking around to see if the guests were amused. A few of them chuckled, taking their cue from Cameron. It is just a joke. Their laughter said, Cameron is so funny. My hands curled into fists at my sides, not from rage, but from the sheer effort of holding back the truth for 5 more minutes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that the man he just tipped could dismantle his entire financial life with 3 phone calls. But I did nothing. I let my shoulders slump slightly. I let my eyes widen. I let them see exactly what they wanted to see. A humiliated woman and her emasculated partner, crushed by the weight of the Kensington wealth. Reed looked down at the $100 bill protruding from his pocket. He did not flush. He did not clench his jaw. His expression remained utterly impassive, like a statue carved from granite. He raised his hand slowly. For a second, I saw Cameron flinch, expecting a punch. But Reed simply reached up and adjusted the bill, tucking it deeper into his pocket so it would not fall out. "Thank you," Reed said. His voice was polite, smooth, and carried just enough volume to be heard by the circle of onlookers. "I will keep this safe." Cameron blinked. He had expected resistance. He had expected a fight that would allow him to call security. He did not know how to handle a man who accepted the insult with the grace of a king accepting a tribute. "Right," Cameron scoffed, recovering his composure. "You do that." He turned back to me, his face hardening. "Now, Briar," Cameron said, his voice dropping to a warning tone. "You have said hello. You have introduced your friend, but this is a private event, and frankly, your vibe is bringing everyone down." "I just wanted to speak to Dad," I said, injecting a tremor into my voice. "It is Christmas." "Walter is busy," Diane snapped. Stepping next to Cameron, they stood together, a united front of exclusion. "He does not want to talk about your problems tonight. Briar, we are celebrating." "Celebrating what?" I asked softly. "Success," Cameron answered, spreading his arms to encompass the room. "Family, legacy, things you would understand if you stopped trying to sabotage us." Paige zoomed in on my face with her phone. "Seriously, Briar, just go. You are embarrassing yourself." I looked at them. The unholy trinity, the narcissist, the enabler, and the golden child. They were so confident. They thought the walls of Renford House were made of stone, protecting them from the world. They thought I was there to beg for a seat at the table. I looked at Reed. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. The recording device in his pocket, nestled right next to the $100 bill, was rolling. We had the insult. We had the exclusion. We had the hostility. "I understand," I said, raising my chin. "I will not stay long. I just have a small gift for the family. It seemed wrong to leave without giving it to you." Cameron rolled his eyes. "We do not want your homemade crafts, Briar." "It is not a craft," I said. I lifted the black portfolio. "It is paperwork. I think you will find it very illuminating." Cameron looked at the portfolio, then back at my face. He saw something there that made him pause. He saw that I was not crying. He saw that I was not shaking. "What is that?" he asked, suspicious now. "Just some light reading for the holiday," I said. "Shall we do this in the library? Or do you want to open your present in front of everyone?" Diane looked at the crowd. She hated scenes unless she was the one causing them. "Library," she hissed. 5 minutes, then you leave." 5 minutes is all I need," I promised. Cameron sneered, gesturing for the security guard to follow us, just in case. "Fine," Cameron said. "Make it quick. I have guests to entertain." He turned and walked toward the library, expecting us to follow like obedient dogs. Diane and Paige trailed him. I looked at Reed. He patted his breast pocket where the $100 bill sat. "That was generous of him," Reed murmured as we began to walk. "That covers the filing fee for the eviction notice." "Almost to the penny," I agreed. We walked through the crowd, parting the sea of tuxedos and gowns. The silence followed us. They thought they were watching a family tragedy. They thought they were watching a daughter being scolded. They had no idea they were watching the executioners walking toward the scaffold. We had not even made it to the library doors before the sound of metal striking crystal cut through the murmurs of the room. It was a sharp, piercing chime that demanded immediate silence. My father, Walter, was standing on the raised platform near the grand piano, a heavy crystal tumbler in one hand and a silver spoon in the other. He swayed slightly, his face flushed with the kind of ruddiness that comes from 3 decades of expensive scotch and unchecked blood pressure. He looked around the room, basking in the sudden attention. He loved this part. He loved the moment when all eyes were on him, waiting for his wisdom, unaware that his wisdom was usually just a recycled platitude or a veiled insult. "Everyone, please," Walter boomed, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the high ceilings. "A moment, just a moment." Cameron, who had been escorting us out like prisoners, stopped. He grabbed my elbow, his grip tight. "Stay put," Cameron whispered. "Walter wants to speak. Do not embarrass us by walking out while he is talking." He shoved me lightly toward a small, velvet-covered bench near the wall, forcing me and Reed to sit like children in a timeout while the adults spoke. It was a calculated move. It placed us physically lower than everyone else. It made us spectators to their glory. I sat, the chair legs scraped against the hardwood, a small sound lost in the shuffling of the crowd. Reed sat beside me, his briefcase resting on his knees, his posture relaxed but alert. Walter raised his glass toward Cameron. "Christmas is a time for reflection," Walter announced, his words slightly slurred but projecting well. "And when I look around this room, I see prosperity, I see tradition, but most of all, I see gratitude." The crowd murmured their agreement. "We have had a hard few years," Walter continued, his gaze drifting over the room before landing heavily on Cameron. "Markets change, tides turn. There were moments when I thought the Kensington legacy might falter." He paused for dramatic effect. Diane stood by his side, gazing up at him with practiced adoration, though I saw her eyes dart nervously toward me. But then, Walter smiled, a wide, magnanimous expression that did not reach his cold eyes. "We were blessed. We were blessed not just with wealth, but with loyalty. I want to raise a toast to the man who stepped in when the waters got rough, the man who steered this ship back to port, my son-in-law, Cameron." Applause broke out. It was polite, rhythmic, and hollow. Cameron puffed out his chest, nodding graciously to the room, accepting the praise as if it were his birthright. "Cameron is a builder," Walter said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone could hear. "He is a fixer. He understands that family means sacrifice. He understands that you do whatever it takes to keep the name shining." Then, Walter's eyes shifted. He did not look directly at me, but he looked just above my head, at the space where I would have been standing if I were worthy. "We all know that not every branch on the tree bears fruit," Walter said, his tone sharpening. "Some children, they are just heavy. They weigh the bough down. They exhaust the resources. They take, and they complain, and they bring nothing to the table but their own fragile feelings." The room went deadly quiet. The insult was so thin it was transparent. Everyone knew who he was talking about. I could feel the gazes of the guests sliding toward me, pitying and judgmental. "But Cameron," Walter said, raising his voice again to override the tension, "Cameron is the child who gives. He saved this family. To Cameron." "To Cameron!" the crowd echoed. They drank. They laughed. It was a terrible sound. It sounded like silverware clashing in a drawer, metallic, harsh, and utterly devoid of joy. They were laughing because they were relieved they were not the ones being targeted. They were laughing because it was easier to mock the outcast than to question the king. I looked at Reed. He did not look at Walter. He was looking at his watch, timing the speech, marking the timestamp for the recording. I felt a cold fire ignite in my stomach. It was not the hot, tearful anger of my 20s. It was the freezing burn of absolute resolution. I did not wait for the applause to die down. I stood up. I did not do it quietly. I pushed the heavy velvet bench back with the back of my knees. The wooden legs shrieked against the polished oak floor, a long, jagged sound that tore through the polite applause like a knife through canvas. Screech! The noise was agonizingly loud. Heads snapped toward me. The applause faltered and died. Walter stopped mid-sip, his glass frozen halfway to his mouth. I stood there, alone in the sudden silence, my black coat looking like a shadow against the festive gold decor. I did not shout. I did not scream. I projected my voice with the calm, flat affect of a judge reading a verdict. "Saved the family?" I asked. My voice carried. It was steady. "That is an interesting choice of words. Dad, did he save the family with money? Or did he save it by ensuring silence for the things that should not exist?" Walter's face went purple. The glass in his hand shook. "Briar!" Diane shrieked. She abandoned her spot next to Walter and rushed toward the center of the room, waving her hands as if she could physically swat my words out of the air. "Oh, God. She is doing it again. Ignore her. She is having an episode." Diane turned to the nearest cluster of guests, her smile stretching so wide it looked painful. "She is very sensitive. She imagines things. We have been trying to get her help for years. But she makes up these stories to get attention. It is sad." "Really?" Paige chimed in from the side, her phone still raised, capturing the drama for her audience. "Briar just loves playing the victim. She cannot stand it when someone else gets credit." The narrative was being spun in real time. I was the crazy daughter. I was the jealous sister. I was the instability that the noble Kensingtons, had to endure. Cameron saw his opening. He saw a chance to be the hero again. He stepped away from the group and walked toward me. He moved with the heavy, threatening gait of a bouncer. He entered my personal space, towering over me, using his height to intimidate. "You need to stop," Cameron said. His voice was low, a growl meant only for me and Reed. "You are making a fool of yourself. Look at you, shaking in your cheap dress." He leaned in closer. I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the cloying scent of his cologne. "You are forgetting your position. Briar," he hissed. "You are nothing here. You are a guest on probation. And if you say one more word, I will have you thrown out into the street where you belong." He thought I would flinch. He thought I would step back. He thought I was still the girl who was afraid of his anger. I looked him in the eyes. I let him see the absolute lack of fear in mine. "No, Cameron," I said. My voice was not a whisper. It was a declaration. "I am not forgetting my position, but tonight, I am here to remind you of yours." I gestured to Reed. Reed stood up. He did not scrape his chair. He rose fluidly, like smoke rising from a fire. He stepped forward, placing himself just slightly ahead of me, not to protect me, but to present the evidence. "I think," I said, my eyes never leaving Cameron's face, "that the guests might want to know exactly what saving the family cost, and who actually paid the bill." Cameron's smirk faltered. For the first time, he looked at Reed not as a driver, but as a threat. "What are you talking about?" Cameron demanded. "The library," I said, pointing to the double doors. "Now, unless you want me to explain the term fraudulent conveyance to Mrs. Abernathy right here in the foyer." The color drained from Cameron's face. He knew that term. He knew exactly what it meant. Walter lowered his glass. Diane stopped her frantic explaining. The room hung in a suspended state of tension, waiting for the string to snap. "In the library," Walter barked, his voice losing its festive cheer. "Now!" It was not an invitation. It was a retreat. I smiled, a small, calm thing. "After you," I said. The heavy mahogany doors of the library clicked shut, sealing us inside. The muffled thrum of the jazz band and the chatter of the party instantly vanished, replaced by the smell of old leather, unread books, and the thick, suffocating tension of a family at war. Cameron wasted no time. He did not sit down. He did not offer us a drink. He turned to the security guard who had followed us in, a broad-shouldered man named Miller, whom Cameron had hired specifically for tonight to keep out riffraff. "Miller," Cameron said, adjusting his velvet cuffs with a bored expression. "Escort them out through the side exit. I gave them 5 minutes. But honestly, I am bored. If they resist, feel free to be thorough." It was a power move, plain and simple. He wanted to show me that my presence was subject to his whim. He wanted to throw me out like trash before I could even open my mouth. Miller nodded and took a heavy step toward me, his hand reaching out to grab my upper arm. But his hand never made contact. Reed moved. It was not a violent motion. He did not lunge or strike. He simply stepped into the space between Miller and me, occupying the air with a sudden, immovable solidity. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his eyes were locked on the guard with a terrifying intensity. "I would not do that if I were you," Reed said. His voice was not loud. It was conversational, almost pleasant, but there was a steel rod running through the center of it that made Miller freeze mid-step. "Step aside, sir." Miller grunted, though he looked uncertain. "Mr. Miller, is it?" Reed asked, glancing at the name tag on the man's chest. "You are licensed by the state of South Carolina as a private security contractor. That license prohibits you from physically engaging a guest who poses no immediate threat to life or property. If you put your hand on Ms. Kensington, you are committing assault. I will have your license revoked by morning, and I will file a civil suit against you personally for damages before the sun comes up." Miller blinked. He looked from Reed to Cameron, his hand hovering in the air. He was paid to bounce drunk uncles, not to debate legal statutes with men in bespoke suits. Cameron let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He stepped around the leather armchair, his face twisting into a sneer. "Who do you think you are?" Cameron spat. "You are a driver. You are a nobody. You think you can come into my house and threaten my staff?" Reed did not look at Cameron. He reached into his inner jacket pocket. Cameron flinched, perhaps expecting a weapon. Reed pulled out a small, cream-colored card case. He extracted a single, crisp business card and placed it gently on the edge of the antique desk that dominated the center of the room. "I am not a driver, Cameron," Reed said. He slid the card across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of my father, who was leaning against the desk, nursing his drink. Walter looked down at the card. I saw his eyes squint as he read the embossed text. "Reed Halston," Reed recited, his voice filling the room. "Senior Risk Analyst, Graymont Compliance Group." The name landed with a thud. My mother, Diane, frowned, smoothing the front of her dress. "Graymont?" she asked, looking at Walter. "Is that an insurance company?" But Walter knew. I saw the blood drain from his face. He knew Graymont because his own company had once tried to hire them to bury a regulatory scandal and had been rejected because the risk was too high. Graymont was not insurance. Graymont was the grim reaper of the corporate world. They were the people you called when the FBI was at the door, or when you needed to strip a company down to its bones. "What is this?" Walter asked, his voice rough. "Why is a compliance officer in my library?" Reed adjusted his tie. "I am here in a professional capacity. I am currently representing the entity that holds the controlling interest in the debt obligations attached to this property." Cameron scoffed, walking over to pour himself a drink, trying to regain the upper hand. "English, please. We do not need the legal mumbo-jumbo. You are Breyer's boyfriend. You are trying to sound important." "I am saying," Reed continued, ignoring Cameron completely, "that the mortgage on Renford House, along with the 2 secondary liens and the bridge loan your father signed, were sold 3 days ago. I represent the new note holder." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the foyer. This was the silence of confusion shifting into fear. Walter slammed his glass down on the desk. Whiskey splashed over the rim, staining the leather blotter. "That is nonsense," Walter barked. "I have a relationship with the bank. I have known the branch manager for 20 years. They would never sell my debt without calling me." "Banks do not have friends, Walter," I said. I stepped forward. I walked past Miller, who was now backing away toward the door, realizing he was out of his depth. I walked past Diane, who was staring at Reed with her mouth slightly open. I walked up to the desk. I was holding the black portfolio against my chest. I felt the heat of it through the leather. This was it. This was the moment I had practiced in the mirror. This was the moment I had played out in my head every time they forgot my birthday or criticized my career. The bank has a risk algorithm, I said calmly. And last month, your risk score hit the red zone. You missed the November payment. You were late on the October payment, and the collateral, this house, was appraised at a value lower than the outstanding balance because you have deferred maintenance on the roof and the foundation. How do you know that? Diane whispered. We never told you that. I know, I said, because I read the file. I lifted the heavy portfolio. I held it in the air for a second, letting them see the seal, the thickness of the paper. Then I dropped it. Thud. The sound was heavy, final. It sounded like a gavel striking a block of wood. It echoed in the high-ceilinged room, making Diane jump. You do not own this house, Dad, I said, looking my father directly in the eyes. Walter's face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck stood out. I built this life. I bought this house 30 years ago. It is mine. No, I corrected him. You bought it, then you refinanced it, then you transferred it to a shell company to hide it, then you borrowed against it to pay for Cameron's cars and Mom's vacations. You hollowed it out. Dad, you ate the equity until there was nothing left but a shell. I placed my hand on the portfolio. And now, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, you are just a tenant. You are living inside something you pawned. Cameron strode forward, his face twisted with rage. You are lying. This is a bluff. You printed some papers off the internet to scare us. You think you can come in here and play pretend? He reached for the folder. I would not touch that if I were you, Reed warned from behind me. Those are original notarized documents. If you destroy them, it is a felony, and since I am a witness, you will be arrested before the party is over. Cameron's hand froze inches from the leather cover. He looked at Reed, then at me. For the first time, the arrogance cracked. He looked at the business card on the table. He looked at the confidence in my stance. Who? Cameron asked, his voice shaking slightly. Who bought the debt? Who are you representing? He was looking for a name, a competitor, a shark from New York, someone he could bribe or charm. I smiled. It was the same smile I had worn when I told them perfect in the text message. Open it, I said. Walter's hands were trembling as he reached out. He flipped open the leather cover. He stared at the top page. He stared at the name listed under Assiné. He did not speak. He could not speak. He just looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horror that went beyond money. He looked at me as if he was seeing a stranger. No, Walter whispered. That is impossible. What? Diane demanded, grabbing his arm. Walter, what does it say? Who is it? It is not a who, Mom, I said. It is an entity. I leaned over the desk, invading their space, reclaiming the power they had stolen from me for 34 years. But if you want to know who controls the entity, I said, you do not need to look at the paper. You just need to look at the daughter you tried to erase. The silence in the library was no longer the stunned silence of a party interrupted. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of a tomb. My father, Walter, was staring at the document on the desk as if it were a poisonous snake that had just bitten him. He traced the line where the assignee was listed, his finger trembling. Chimera Holdings, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a scalpel. That is the company you set up 5 years ago, isn't it? You told everyone it was for estate planning. You told everyone it was to ensure that the house would stay in the family for generations, protected from inheritance taxes. Walter looked up, his eyes bloodshot. It is a standard asset protection strategy. Breyer, you wouldn't understand. It is high-level finance. I understand it perfectly, I corrected him, stepping closer to the desk. I understand that you did not move the deed to Chimera to protect the house for us. You moved it to hide the cash flow problems from the IRS and your business partners. Chimera isn't a vault, Dad. It is a screen. I looked around at the opulent room, the mahogany bookshelves, the silk curtains. You needed to keep up appearances, I continued, pacing slowly in front of the desk. The country club dues, The leasing payments on Cameron's Porsche. These parties that cost $50,000 a night, but the liquid cash wasn't there anymore, was it? The legacy business has been bleeding revenue for 3 years. Shut up, Cameron snapped, but there was no heat in it. He was leaning against the mantel, his face pale. He knew I had the numbers. You used Chimera to take out loans, I explained, turning to look at my mother, Diane. She was clutching her pearl necklace as if it were a rosary. Not standard mortgages. You couldn't get those because your debt-to-income ratio was already ruined. You went to private equity lenders, hard money loans, high interest, short terms. It was a bridge loan, Walter shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. Just until the market turned. The market didn't turn, I said calmly. And the interest rate on that bridge loan was 12%, compounding. When the first balloon payment came due last year, you didn't have the capital, so what did you do? You listened to Cameron. I looked at my brother-in-law. He refused to meet my eyes. Cameron suggested you refinance with a secondary lender to pay off the interest on the first one. I said, it is called debt churning. It is a spiral. You were borrowing money at 15% to pay off debt at 12%. You were burning the furniture to keep the house warm. We had a plan, Cameron muttered. We were closing a deal in January. The bank does not care about your January deals, I said. The bank cares that you have missed the last 3 payments entirely. You ghosted them. You stopped answering their calls because you thought you were Walter Kensington, and they wouldn't dare foreclose on a Kensington during the holidays. I leaned in, resting my knuckles on the cold wood of the desk. But here's the thing about distressed debt. Dad, banks hate it. It looks bad on their balance sheets at the end of the year. They want it gone. They will sell it to anyone who is willing to pay cash just to get the red ink off their ledger. Walter let out a dry, incredulous laugh. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain. And you are the buyer? He scoffed. You? The girl who lives in a converted warehouse? You expect me to believe you walked into a bank and bought a multi-million-dollar note? You do not have that kind of money. Breyer, you never have. It was the argument they always fell back on. In their world, power was directly correlated to visible wealth. If you didn't have the flashy car, you didn't have the power. They couldn't conceive of a world where power was quiet. You are right, I said. I do not have $3 million sitting in a checking account. I stood up straight, brushing a piece of lint off my black coat. But I didn't need $3 million. I didn't buy the house. Dad, I bought the debt. And when a debt is this toxic, when the borrower is this delinquent, the bank sells it for pennies on the dollar. I signaled to Reed. Reed reached into his briefcase again. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, the transaction receipt and the transfer addendum. The purchase price was 40 cents on the dollar, Reed said, his voice clinical. Breyer has been saving and investing aggressively for 10 years while you were buying champagne. She had enough to cover the discounted principal. The bank was thrilled to take the cash and wash their hands of you. Reed placed the document in front of Walter. It is all there, Reed said. The transaction date was December 18th. The funds cleared yesterday. The entity that now owns the mortgage, the liens, and the personal guarantee you signed is a trust. And the sole beneficiary of that trust is Breyer Kensington. Walter stared at the number on the page. He stared at the signature of the bank vice president, a man he had played golf with, a man he thought was his friend. He sold me out, Walter whispered. Bob sold me out. Bob is a banker, I said. He made a business decision, just like you did when you decided to cut me out of the family because I wasn't elite enough. Diane made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. She looked toward the library doors, where the sound of the party was still faintly audible. She looked at the guests who were eating her food and drinking her wine, completely unaware that their hosts were technically insolvent. Breyer, Diane said, her voice trembling. What are you going to do? Are you going to go out there and tell them? Are you going to announce this? She walked over to me, her eyes pleading. For the first time in my life, She wasn't looking at me with disappointment. She was looking at me with fear. "Think about the humiliation," Diane whispered. "Think about what people will say. You will destroy our reputation. You will make us a laughingstock. Is that what you want? To humiliate your mother and father in front of the whole town?" I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had watched me be emotionally abused by Cameron and told me it was my fault. I looked at the woman who had sent a text message uninviting me to Christmas because I didn't fit the aesthetic. I looked at the closed doors. I could picture them out there. Mrs. Abernathy, Mr. Sterling, the entire fake, glittering ecosystem that my parents had sacrificed their souls to maintain. "No, Mom," I said softly. I picked up the portfolio from the desk and held it like a shield. "I do not care about humiliating you," I said. "You are my parents. Despite everything, I take no joy in your pain." I looked at Cameron, who was staring at the floor, defeated. "I am not here to humiliate people," I said, my voice hardening into stone. "I am here to humiliate the lie. I am here to expose the fact that you looked down on me for being average while you were living on borrowed time and stolen money." I turned to Reed. "Show them the eviction clause," I said. Reed flipped the page. "According to the terms of the commercial loan you signed," Reed said, "upon change of ownership of the note, the new creditor has the right to inspect the property to ensure the collateral is being maintained. If the creditor finds evidence of negligence or waste, they can demand immediate possession." "We haven't neglected the house," Walter protested. "You haven't fixed the roof in 3 years," I countered. "And there is water damage in the east wing you have been painting over instead of repairing. That is waste. That is negligence." "So," I said, looking at the three of them, "the party is over. Not just tonight. The whole party. The 30-year party you have been throwing on credit." Diane covered her mouth with her hand. Walter sank into his leather chair, looking suddenly very old and very small. They realized then that this wasn't a family squabble. This wasn't a daughter acting out. This was a foreclosure, and I was the bank. The sound of my father collapsing into his chair should have been the end of it. The room was heavy with the smell of defeat, a thick, cloying scent that usually accompanies the realization that the game is over. My mother was weeping silently, her hands covering her face, and my father looked like a man who had just watched his own obituary being printed. But Cameron did not look defeated. He stood by the fireplace, his silhouette sharp against the glow of the dying embers. He looked at the paperwork, then at Reed, and finally at me, and then he started to laugh. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a wet, ugly sound that bubbled up from his chest, devoid of humor. It was the laugh of a man who realizes he has nothing left to lose, and therefore has become the most dangerous person in the room. "You think you are so smart," Cameron said, shaking his head. "You think you are the first person to look at the numbers? You think you are the first person to figure out that the ship is sinking?" He reached into the inner pocket of his velvet tuxedo jacket, the same pocket where he kept his expensive cigars, but he did not pull out a cigar. He pulled out a small, silver USB drive. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, letting the light from the chandelier catch the metal casing. It looked harmless. It looked like something you would use to store family photos. But the way he held it, like a detonator, made the air in the room turn instantly cold. "You bought the debt, Breyer. Congratulations," Cameron sneered. "You own the mortgage. You own the bricks and the mortar. But you do not know what happened inside these walls to pay for them." My father's head snapped up. The color, which had drained from his face earlier, returned in a rush of terrified gray. "Cameron," Walter croaked, his voice cracking, "put that away." "No, Walter," Cameron said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried to every corner of the library. "She wants the truth. Let us give her the truth." He took a step toward me, brandishing the drive like a knife. "This house wasn't just a home," Cameron said, his eyes locking onto mine with manic intensity. "Chimera Holdings didn't just borrow money, it moved money, for 5 years. I have been washing funds through this company to hide assets for your father's partners, offshore accounts, unreported income, tax evasion on a scale that would put you in federal prison for 20 years. Diane let out a strangled cry. Cameron, please, you promised. Promised to fix it, Cameron roared, spinning on her. I promised to keep the lifestyle going, and I did. I broke the law every single day to keep you in diamonds and Walter in scotch. I risked my neck to keep this pathetic family afloat. He turned back to me, his smile returning, tight and cruel. If you foreclose on this house, Cameron said, his voice steadying into a cold threat, if you bring in auditors to look at the books, this drive goes to the IRS. It goes to the FBI. It goes to every regulatory agency in the country. He took another step closer. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. You want to take the house? Fine, he spat. But the moment you file that paperwork, your father goes to prison, your mother goes to prison as an accessory, and I will testify against them to cut a deal. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. My parents were no longer looking at me with anger or disappointment. They were looking at me with absolute, abject terror. Walter's eyes were wide, pleading. He was begging me. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking down on me. He was looking up, praying that I would have mercy. He was silently asking me to stop, to tear up the papers, to walk away and let the rot continue because the alternative was a concrete cell. Diane reached out a trembling hand toward me. Briar, baby, please, do not do this. We will lose everything. You are going to lose everything anyway, I said softly, but my voice was drowned out by a sudden wail from the corner. It was Paige. My sister was slumped against the bookshelf, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup, but she wasn't looking at our parents. She was looking at her phone, at the life she had curated. If they go to jail, who pays for my apartment? Paige sobbed, her voice shrill with selfishness. What happens to my trips? People will think we are criminals. I cannot be an influencer if my dad is in prison. She was crying for her image. She was crying for the loss of her unearned privilege. It was pathetic, and it was perfectly on brand. Cameron watched them crumble with satisfaction. He felt the power returning to him. He had played his ace. He had turned my victory into a hostage situation. He leaned in close to me, so close that I could see the dilated pupils of his eyes. Do you really want that on your conscience, Briar? He whispered, loud enough for Reed and my parents to hear. Do you want to be the daughter who sent her elderly parents to die in federal prison? Because that is what will happen. They will die in there, and it will be your fault. He straightened up, adjusting his jacket, looking like he had just won a negotiation. I am not afraid to fall, Briar, Cameron declared, his voice ringing with bravado. I have survived worse, but if I go down, I am dragging every single one of you into the pit with me. So here's the deal. You hand over those papers, you sign the debt back over to me for $1, and you walk out of here and never come back. He held out his hand, expecting me to surrender the black portfolio. The room held its breath. My parents held their breath. They thought I was trapped. They thought the emotional blackmail would work because they still believed that deep down, I was the girl who desperately wanted their approval. They thought I would sacrifice justice to save them from the consequences of their own greed. I stood there for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. I looked at the USB drive in his hand. I looked at the fear in my father's eyes. I looked at the smug certainty on Cameron's face. And then, I did something that confused them all. I smiled. It was not a nervous smile. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter who watches the prey step directly onto the pressure plate of the trap. Cameron's hand faltered. He saw the smile, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine doubt crossed his face. What is so funny? He demanded. I looked at Reed. Reed was already reaching into his jacket pocket again. I turned back to Cameron. You think you just played a trump card, I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. You think you just cornered me. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, forcing him to look down at me. But the truth is, Cameron, I said, I was waiting for you to say exactly that. Reed did not shout. He did not move aggressively. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at Cameron with the mild curiosity of an entomologist studying a particularly noisy beetle. I want to be absolutely clear about the terms of this negotiation, Reed said. His voice was level, cutting through the thick tension of the room like a razor blade. He tilted his head slightly, addressing Cameron. You are stating, for the record, that you possess evidence of federal crimes committed by Walter and Diane Kensington, and you are stating that you will release this evidence to law enforcement agencies, thereby incriminating them and yourself, unless Breyer forgives the debt and transfers the property rights back to your control. Cameron sneered, his confidence blinding him to the precision of the question. He thought Reed was looking for a loophole, a way to beg for a compromise. That is exactly what I am saying, Cameron barked, shaking the USB drive in the air. It is a trade. Her silence for their freedom. It is called leverage. Do you need me to spell it out for you? Reed paused for a heartbeat, his expression unreadable. And you are acknowledging, Reed continued, that you are acting in concert with her parents to force this financial concession through the threat of reputational and legal harm? I am doing what needs to be done, Cameron shouted. Yes, I am threatening her. I am blackmailing her. Call it whatever legal term makes you feel better. But unless she signs that paper, her parents are going to prison. Is that clear enough for you? Reed nodded slowly. A look of satisfaction, brief and sharp, crossed his face. Yes, Reed said. That is sufficient. He reached up and tapped the small, black earpiece he was wearing. Thank you. Cameron, Reed said, you have just provided a voluntary, confessed admission of extortion and conspiracy. I stepped forward, lifting my hand to point at the silver pen still clipped to Reed's breast pocket. The tiny blue light was pulsing rhythmically. We have been recording since we walked through the front door, I said. South Carolina is a one-party consent state for audio recording. As long as one person in the conversation consents, that being Reed, the recording is entirely legal and admissible in court. The color did not just drain from Cameron's face, it seemed to evaporate. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the USB drive in his hand, then at the pen in Reed's pocket. He realized, with a dawn of horror, that he had just confessed to a felony while trying to cover up another felony. The guests near the open library doors began to react. It was a ripple of panic. These were people who valued their social standing above all else. Being at a party was one thing. Being present at the scene of a crime was another. I saw Mrs. Abernathy take 2 steps back, clutching her clutch bag to her chest. I saw Mr. Sterling quietly slip his phone into his pocket, his eyes darting toward the exit, calculating how fast he could leave without being noticed. The air of exclusivity had shattered, replaced by the stench of liability. But Reed was not finished. He placed his briefcase on the desk, right next to the spilled scotch. He opened a separate compartment and pulled out a document bound in blue legal paper. It looked old. The edges were slightly yellowed, contrasting with the crisp white of the foreclosure papers. The recording seals your fate regarding the extortion charges, Reed said, sliding the blue document toward my mother. But Cameron's confession just triggered something far more permanent regarding the family assets. Diane looked down at the document. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely focus on the text. "What is this?" she whispered. That is my mother's signature." "It is the Margaret Kensington Revocable Trust," Reed explained. Specifically, the contingency amendment she filed 6 months before she died. Diane looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. "Mother died broke. She left nothing. The lawyers told us the estate was empty." "She did not die broke," I said, my voice cold. "She died disappointed. She knew exactly who you were, Mom. She knew who Dad was, and she saw what Cameron was becoming." I walked around the desk so I was standing right next to my father. Grandma put the remainder of her liquid assets, about $5 million in bonds, and the original title to the land this house sits on, into a dormant trust. I said, "She hid it. She knew if she gave it to you, you would squander it, or Cameron would steal it, so she created a lockbox." Reed pointed to a highlighted paragraph on the third page of the document. "This is the anti-coercion clause," Reed stated. "It stipulates that the assets in the trust remain frozen until Breyer turns 40, at which point they would be distributed to the family. However, there is an acceleration trigger. If any beneficiary of the estate, specifically Walter, Diane, or their spouses, is found to be colluding with a third party to threaten, intimidate, or extort Breyer Kensington for financial gain, the trust is immediately dissolved." Reed looked up, removing his glasses. "And the entirety of the assets," he finished, "transfers solely and irrevocably to Breyer Kensington." Diane let out a sound that was less a scream and more a gasp of physical pain. She grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. $5 million? She choked out. "She had $5 million? And you took it?" "I did not take anything," I said. "You gave it to me." I gestured to Cameron, who was now leaning against the mantelpiece, looking like a man who had been gutted. "The trigger required proof," I explained. "It required clear, undeniable evidence that you were willing to destroy me to save yourselves. Grandma didn't think you would do it. She hoped she was wrong. She hoped the clause would never be used." I looked at my sister, Paige, who had stopped crying and was staring at me with a mixture of awe and hatred. She realized that the money she thought was gone had been sitting there all along, waiting for them to be decent people, and they had failed the test. "She left us nothing!" Paige screamed, her voice cracking. "She hated us!" "No," I said, and my voice dropped to a register that silenced the room completely. "She didn't leave you money. Paige, she left you a test." I looked at my parents, who were staring at the blue document as if it were a death warrant. "Grandma didn't leave a fortune," I said, delivering the final blow. "She left a trap designed specifically for the people she knew would eventually try to do something dirty, and you walked right into it." The irony hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They had tried to exclude me to save their image. They had tried to blackmail me to save their house, and in doing so, they had unlocked the only fortune left in the family and handed it directly to the person they were trying to destroy. Diane slumped into the chair next to Walter. She looked at Cameron with pure venom. It was over. The house was gone. The secret money was gone. And the daughter they had rejected was now the only person in the room with a future. The air in the library was no longer just tense. It was final. The revelation of the trust fund had sucked the last pockets of oxygen out of the room, leaving my family gasping in the vacuum of their own greed. They were looking at the papers on the desk not as legal documents, but as the debris of a plane crash they had piloted directly into the ground. Reed did not give them time to mourn the money they had lost. He reached into his briefcase for the final time. "We are moving to the operational phase," Reed announced. His voice was devoid of triumph, which somehow made it worse. It was just business. "Since Breyer is now the legal owner of the mortgage and the sole beneficiary of the land trust, she has the authority to dictate the occupancy of the premises immediately. Under the terms of the default, the grace period expired at midnight yesterday." I turned my head slowly toward Miller, the security guard who had been backing away toward the door. He froze, his eyes darting between Cameron and me. "Mr. Miller?" I said, my voice steady. "The company that hired you is effectively bankrupt. As the representative of the new management, I am authorizing your continued employment for the remainder of the evening, provided you follow my instructions." Miller straightened up. He was a mercenary, and mercenaries follow the person who signs the checks. "Yes, ma'am," Miller said. "I want Mr. Cameron escorted off the property," I said, pointing at my brother-in-law. "He is trespassing. If he resists, you are authorized to remove him physically." Cameron's face twisted into a mask of pure animal panic. He lunged. It was a desperate, clumsy move. He threw himself toward the desk, his hands clawing for the black portfolio, screaming that he would burn it, that he would destroy the proof. Reed did not flinch. He did not throw a punch. He simply stepped into Cameron's path and used his shoulder to check Cameron's momentum, sending him stumbling back against the bookshelf. It was not a fight. It was a containment. "That is assault," Reed said calmly, adjusting his cuffs. "And since we are still recording, I would suggest you stop before you add a violent crime to your list of financial ones." Miller stepped in then, grabbing Cameron by the arm with a grip that clearly communicated he was done being polite. Cameron thrashed, shouting obscenities, but he was powerless. The facade of the golden boy had cracked, revealing the frightened fraud beneath. My father, Walter, collapsed back into his leather chair. He looked small, the bluster, the arrogance, the weight of the patriarch. It was all gone. He looked around the library, at the books he had never read and the scotch he could no longer afford. He realized then that he had not just lost a daughter in the shuffle of paperwork. He had lost his entire kingdom because he had been too proud to admit he was drowning. "Briar," Diane sobbed. Rushing toward me, she reached out, trying to grab my hands, but I kept them clasped around the portfolio. "Please, you cannot do this. We are your family. Think about what people will say. Think about the scandal. We will be ruined." I looked down at her. Even now, at the very end, her plea was not about me. She did not say she was sorry for hurting me. She did not say she regretted choosing Cameron over her own flesh and blood. She only cared about the optics. She only cared about the ruin. "I am thinking about the scandal. Mom," I said, "that is why I am the one ending it." "You are so selfish," Paige shrieked from the corner. She was clutching her phone, terrified that her lifestyle was about to evaporate. "You always make everything about you. Why can't you just let it go? Why do you have to punish us?" I turned to my sister. I looked at the girl I had protected for years, the girl who had grown into a woman capable of watching me bleed without blinking. "I am not punishing you, Paige," I said. "I am just stopping the payments. I am done paying for your selfishness with my dignity." Reed cleared his throat. He placed one final document on the desk. It was a single page, crisp and white. "This is the exit strategy," Reed said. The room went silent. Walter looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Briar is not interested in seeing you in prison," Reed explained, his tone cool. "Despite your best efforts to put her there, she has no desire to drag the Kensington name through a federal trial. It is messy, and it is loud." He tapped the paper. "This is a settlement agreement. If you sign this, Briar agrees to absorb the debt within the trust. She will handle the foreclosure quietly. She will restructure the loans so there is no public bankruptcy. She will even provide a modest monthly stipend for Walter and Diane to live in a small apartment across town, ensuring you are not homeless." Diane let out a breath of relief, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, thank God. Thank you, Briar. Thank you." "However," Reed interrupted, his voice sharpening like a knife edge, "there are conditions." "What conditions?" Cameron spat, struggling against Miller's grip. "Total severance," I said. I stepped forward, looking at each of them in turn. "You sign a non-disclosure agreement. You never speak my name to the press. You never mention me on social media. You never contact me again. No birthdays, no Christmases, no emergency calls when you get sick." I leaned in closer to my father. "If you sign this, I save you from prison, but in exchange, I am dead to you. You wanted to erase me from the party? Fine. Now you have to erase me from your life, permanently." Walter stared at me. He saw the resolve in my eyes. He realized that this was not a negotiation. It was a funeral for our relationship. "You would do that?" Walter whispered. "You would cut us off?" "You cut me off first, Dad," I said softly. "I am just locking the door." Slowly, with a shaking hand, Walter reached for the pen. He signed. Diane followed, weeping as she scrawled her name. Paige signed last, looking at me with pure hatred, but she signed because she knew it was the only way to save herself. Cameron started screaming that they were fools, that I would regret it, but his voice was just noise now. Miller dragged him out of the room, his shouts fading down the hallway. I looked at the signed paper. It was done. "Let us go," I said to Reed. We turned and walked out of the library. We walked through the foyer, past the silent guests who were whispering in hushed tones, sensing that the empire had fallen, but not understanding how. I did not stop to explain. I did not stop to gloat. I walked out the front door into the biting cold of the December night. The air was sharp and clean. It felt like freedom. I had not won my family back. You cannot win back people who never truly saw you. But as I got into the car and watched the lights of Renford House fade in the rearview mirror, I knew I had won something far more valuable. I had won my life. I turned to Reed as we drove away. "I did not come to be invited," I said, the words feeling heavy and true on my tongue. "I came to end their right to exclude me." And for the first time in 34 years, the silence that followed was not lonely. It was peaceful. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on whether Briar made the right choice. If you enjoyed this takedown, make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.